Okay, perfecto. The 700 light switches, right? All right, perfect. All right. Testing. All right. Okay, we're good to go. Okay. Good morning, everybody, and welcome back. Or for the first time, I don't know. I haven't been keeping an eye on the class list over the last day, so I'm not 100% sure if people have been moving in and out of the class. Okay, so obviously sociology of youth, and today we are going to start off, looking at a couple of important questions. Specifically, we're going to start our look at the history of childhood and youth, and kind of start trying to build an idea of where these concepts kind of came from historically, building towards, of course, just an understanding of where we are today and what our generational cohorts look like. Before I do that, though, obviously, if you weren't here last time, you can absolutely ask questions by raising your hand. Happy to answer them in that way. I also use this, which is called Slido. It's like a live Q&A thing. Go to that website, put in that code, and you can enter questions. Before I jump into kind of the topic for today, I know people may be moving in and out of the class. Does anybody have any questions about the course before I start? Yeah, please.
If I remember correctly, you mentioned that you recorded the lecture.
Yes.
How can we access it?
I will put a link to a YouTube playlist on the e-class. I just haven't had it yesterday. It was a bit of a nutso day. I haven't had a chance to do so. I'll try to do it, I'm going to say tomorrow. Because I'm like, when do I have time? Tomorrow. Yeah, and it'll all be there, and basically as I go through and update or record them and then put them on the playlist, it should show up. And I'll try to, usually I have time on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and I will try to make sure I'm linking everything back on those days. But yeah, it'll be there if you happen to miss something. Are you planning to skip class on Friday because it's like minus 35 or something? I wish I could. The miss that about being a student is I don't want to go today, so I'm just not going to do that because it's really cold. When you're in charge of the class, it doesn't work out quite as well. Other questions before I jump into content? Speak now or forever hold your peace. No? Okay, so we're going to kind of start our discussion here of the history of kind of youth and childhood with this book. So it's called The Disappearance of Childhood. And it's now, a little bit dated because it, was written first and first published in 1979. So it's not, the most current book, but I think it does a good job in kind of giving us a quick hit kind of history of what where our concept of childhood and youth kind of comes from, right? Now, the second half of the first half of the book, right, the first 4 chapters is really about tracing, the appearance of our sense of, childhood and youth in the West. And then the second half of the book, which we'll talk about briefly at the end of the class, is about Postman's fear that this concept will be undermined by technology. And this is actually I think, one of the kind of recurring themes of the course. When we get later in this chapter, I'm going to talk about an idea from Jean Twenge, who's a psychologist and professor at San Diego State University, who's done a lot of work on generations, what she calls the technology kind of model of generations, right? Basically sort of thinking about how technology ultimately changes our conception of how we think about generations, how we think about young people in major ways, and who gets classified as a young person broadly. Okay, so, all right. Who's Neil Postman? So he basically kind of an interesting character, part of a sort of tradition of mostly media studies. That started out in Toronto and then spilled over in New York City. So he spent most of his career, he's a teacher by trade, right? He went to Columbia for a teaching degree and then got, PhDs in education, but ended up being kind of a media scholar at NYU for a long time. And he wrote, what I think, in the field of, say, science, technology, and society, or media and society studies, some books that became sort of foundational, if, at times people don't love them. So this book, is probably kind of the beginning of his work on technology and its effects on society, which was followed up then by a book called Amusing Ourselves to Death, Public Discourse in the Age of Show Business, which basically said that at some point, because we're such a media-saturated culture, politics and all public discourse would devolve into a form of entertainment. I still maintain that he essentially predicted the rise of Donald Trump. When the reality TV star becomes an actual kind of the president of the United States, we've crossed into, amusing ourselves to death. Mostly Amusing Ourselves to Death is about television. It was written in 1986. So, again, it's still old, but it's still, I think, well regarded. And then his two kind of last books, Technopoly and Building a Bridge to the 18th Century, are both about the effects of technology on society. And basically, his worry that we're giving up all of our autonomy to technology and we're just letting it make all of our decisions for us. Okay. So this book specifically, though, is about kind of trying to trace out where our idea of childhood and youth kind of comes from. Now, Postman, I think, a little bit unhelpfully, and maybe this is a function of the fact that he's writing in, at the end of the 1970s, when he talks about childhood, he's talking about this very broad period that he says is between the age of 7 and the age of 17, right? So encompassing essentially everything that comes once you start primary school all the way through, essentially the end of secondary school. Now, there's problems with this sort of definition, right? It's a very, I think, kind of mid to late 20th century kind of definition. And what's happened since then is we've actually had, I think, this idea of youth expand pretty massively, right? We've had this idea of what we now call in sociology emerging adulthood kind of tacked onto this category, right? So that emerging adulthood basically now refers to, young people who are between the ages of, say, 18 and 29, right? So people who are, essentially, emerging adulthood, you might kind of get the sense from the term. Adults, but not quite adults. And this is a very kind of 21st century, 2010s and 2020s kind of concept, because there came to be this recognition in sociology that, millennials and then Gen Z weren't sort of, at 18, weren't adults in the same way as maybe the baby boomers and the silent generation and even Gen X had been. That there was something fundamentally a little bit more delayed in their process through adulthood. Now, when we get to the end of this unit, and I need to update it a little bit. I was working on the slides yesterday, so I will upload an updated one. We'll talk about what those generations look like. So we'll talk about the silents, we'll talk about the boomers, we'll talk about Gen X, and then millennials and Gen Z, because there's some really interesting kind of differences in a lot of their life patterns. But just to kind of let's give you a little bit of a spoiler, why this is important and how much your generation is different from, say, 3 generations ago, the silent generation. The average, so I was just reading this yesterday and it, made me make a little bit of a double take. Half of women who were married in the 1950s, right, so this is the silent generation who were getting married, were teenagers, right? They were 18 and 19. Compare that to today, where the average age of first marriage for a woman is about 28, right? There's been a 10-year shift. So like the process into adulthood today is a lot slower than, say, what I think Postman was thinking of, where it's like you graduate from high school, you go off, you get a job, you maybe think about getting married in a couple of years. Your generation's a lot different, and so we now have this very much expanded definition of youth, which will go up to like 29, right? I hope I live long enough so that I can once again be included in the definition of youth as I age, right? It's maybe in my 40s we'll start to be called youths again, but probably not. I've aged out of it by a long shot. But right, we're talking about emerging adulthood, because through your 20s, and I'm sorry to say this, you're not doing the things that other generations did, which made them sort of fully adult, right? Getting married, getting a mortgage, having children. That's something that's now put off a lot later. Okay, but that being said, right, he's defining childhood. I think it kind of includes like childhood as we would think of it, and the teenage years or youth in a pretty broad way. And yeah, I think it'll line up in some ways, though it ends earlier than our definition that we'll use for the course, which is going to include everybody really up until the age of 29. One of the things that Postman is really trying to do in the book, though, and I think this is where his focus on technology and the way that it affects our worldview and who we think of as children, is to sort of try to break down this idea that childhood and youth are ultimately a sort of biological or natural category. It's because what he's going to argue in the book is that our definition of childhood emerged because of particular historical circumstances in the West, right? Things that happened in the West, and then it actually took about 400 years from the key kind of event that he thinks triggered the move towards creating a definition of childhood and a kind of modern notion of childhood as we would recognize it. Okay. So, one of the things that Postman does, is he wants to establish the fact that our version of childhood, the way that we think of childhood, particularly as this time of, innocence, right? As a time where everybody, right? Everybody who's between a certain kind of age range is innocent, and they are exempt in a lot of ways from the demands of society, right? Where childhood is this period where you are nurtured into what will eventually be an adult, where you can start taking on social roles, like working, like contributing to your family economically, and all of these sorts of, not really, right? You wouldn't have okay, there was technically no word in Greek that meant what we mean as a child, right? They didn't have that kind of proper sense of this kind of birthday to birthday kind of period where you would have been, raised and nurtured and wouldn't have had any adult responsibilities. Amongst, certain people, the Greeks had a broad concept of youth. Now, this would have applied only to, when we're talking about the Greek city-states, places like Athens, citizens, right? So people who are Athenian citizens, who were part of the kind of elite, they might have had, this kind of period where their young people would have had a period called youth. Now, it's very, very amorphous, right? Wherein, you could be a youth from, say, 10 years old till 35, it depended more on the social role you were taking more than your actual age, right? It was the period, right, where you should be educated, but some citizens would have been educated for a few years, and some would have been educated for a decade, but it wasn't consistent, right? So it was more an idea of, you were a youth because you were, sitting at the feet of a philosopher and learning from him, more so than an age-limited category. Now, this, of course, did not, really include certainly the large underclass of slaves, which made up the economic base of Greek society, right? If you were a slave or a non-citizen, and you were 7 years old, you were put to work, right? You were part of the economy, right? You were part of, you were mucking out a stable, or you were serving in a kitchen or something, right? So it wasn't a universal sense that everybody's children had a childhood or even a youth, right? it was very much, for those who got to be educated, it was the wealthy, the elites, and all of those things. Okay. Make sense? All right. So, in kind of Western antiquity, and we have to sort of put the rest of the world to one side. We're talking here about the West. In the ancient world, right, in kind of the Mediterranean and European world, Postman suggests ancient Rome, right, the Roman Empire, probably had the most defined view of childhood. And one of the things that he sort of suggests is that because the Roman Empire was so big, right, and the Roman Empire was massive, it required, amongst other things, a large class of literate, by ancient standards anyway, of literate people who could administer the empire, right? So a lot of the messages, right, in terms of, what are we doing militarily? Do we retreat? Do we fight back against the Germanic tribes on the northern border? Would have all been communicated by writing from the kind of central location, at first Rome and then Constantinople. But wherever the empire was headquartered, wherever the emperor was, they were the ones handing out orders. And this was mostly done in writing. So this required a lot of people who were able to read and write, which meant a lot of education, right? You had to have a lot of people being educated to serve as this kind of scribal class. And what Postman thinks is that ultimately it was this kind of dedication to the written word, and maybe, somewhere between 15 to maybe 20% of the kind of citizen population amongst Romans would have been literate, right? Pretty high levels by the standards of the ancient world. Now, what Postman kind of suggests is that this education and the fact that you get this, basically people are taught to read, and, he'll get to this when he talks about, the invention of the printing press, moving from simple writing to more complex writing, ultimately sort of creates a sense that some information is for children, some information isn't, right? So you start teaching young people to read with very simple text, and then you move them into more complex text. And he suggests that what you get out of that is a sense that some things are for kids, some things are not. And it creates a sense of shame, right? So, shame, he means, right, that you shouldn't divulge too much information about the world in ways that are inappropriate for children. And we know this, the Romans left a lot of stuff behind. So we know a lot of the things that were part of kind of Roman social life, right? Because we have people like Cicero, who would write these big treatises on what was okay to do in polite Roman society. And amongst the things that were not okay to talk about, right, in a lot of times a public setting, but certainly not okay to talk to children, were things like sex, politics, economics, and war, right? So, a lot of the same things you think of as like, you shouldn't talk about in polite company, right? You shouldn't talk about politics and religion. The Romans had their own list, and it included, politics, economics, sex, and war. So they had a sense that these things weren't for children. And Postman thinks, right, that this was a kind of early flowering of the idea of childhood, right? And again, not evenly distributed, because, amongst the Romans, there were, again, these massive underclasses of people. The Roman economy was very much run by slaves, right? The Romans would go off and capture whole nations and bring them back, and they would become their slaves. And those people, right, there was no teaching them to read and write. There was no, shielding them from any of these things. It was all the time. Yeah, please.
For that sense of shame, do we need to know the name of the educator that...
Cicero? No.
In the book it said, it starts with a Q.
Quintinius, I think, or no, don't worry about it. Yeah, I can't remember either. There's Roman names are funny. They all start with C's and Q's. But yeah, don't worry about the specific name. I won't test you on that. But yeah, there's a lot of kind of, we have a ton of it. The Romans were prolific in terms of writing, essentially like Miss Manners manuals, right? Like what is okay to write about, what's polite, and all of that stuff. Okay. Yes, please.
Do we know like the time of like or what the Romans considered no longer to be child, like a child, or because I imagine it'd be like a much younger.
Yeah, it's definitely kind of towards like early adolescence, right? Be like 13, 14. Definitely not kind of 18 because they lived in a very different world, right? They didn't have the sort of leisure to shield their children for as long. But regardless, and again, it depends on kind of place, time, and location, right? And who you are, right? If you are a slave or if you are a free man, but not a citizen, it's going to be a little bit different. And certain things like, you're going to start working, if you're, a slave, you're going to be working from the time that you're basically able to do something useful, right? Probably somewhere, between 7 and 8, right? Whether it's, helping in the kitchen or whatever, right? There's also a lot of weird things with the Romans. They did, especially with adolescent boys, and girls actually, they didn't have necessarily big qualms about, say, having sex with them. The Romans were pretty okay with that. So it's not exactly our idea, right? And especially like, if you had a slave who was 14 or 15, you could essentially do what you wanted with them, whether that was, sadly, whether that was beat them nearly to death or straight to death, actually, or have sex with them in any way that you wanted if you were a citizen and you owned them, right? So again, there's a kind of echo of what we have today, though it's not an exact parallel, right? Does that make sense? Okay. Other questions? So great questions. I love questions. Okay. So what ultimately happens, right? Obviously, we know nothing lasts forever, and the Roman Empire was no different, right? Without giving you a treatise on Roman history, though you absolutely all should know, and apparently, according to what a TikTok, men think about the Roman Empire quite a bit. But everybody should, I think, probably study Roman history because this particular event ends up being one that's so, I think, traumatic that it's still burned into the consciousness of people in the West. I can't even count the number of times in my life that something happens and someone compares the decline of America to the decline of the Roman Empire. It's super fun to think about, but also kind of weird that we're still hung up on something that happened in 476. Okay, so what happens in 476 in the West, right, is after probably like a 2 centuries long decline, right, the western part of the Roman Empire had been split into 2 parts, the Eastern Roman Empire centered in Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, and the western part of the Roman Empire centered first in Rome and then in Ravenna, both in Italy. But what happens is you get these Germanic tribes that start, the Goths, the Visigoths, the Vandals. If you want to see how burnt into our consciousness Roman history is, Goth, for someone who's kind of dark and brooding, literally comes from these Germanic tribes that invaded the Roman Empire, and the Vandals who sacked Rome and like ripped off all the gold and carted it away. Why do we call people who wreck things Vandals? Is because of these guys, because it wrecked the Roman Empire, and specifically they went into Rome, which had been sort of a unconquered city for a millennium, and sort of trashed it and stole all the good stuff. It's really seared into Western consciousness. All right. Anyway, sorry. Sidebar. But yeah, so following a bunch of these invasions, the western part of the Roman Empire basically collapses. There's some guy in Rome being like, I am Emperor Romulus the Seventh, and then some Teutonic warlord comes in and says, you're absolutely nothing, shut the hell up. And that's the end, the end of the Roman Empire. And what happens at the end of the Roman Empire is basically the whole Roman system that had kind of connected Europe essentially falls apart, right? So there's what had been a kind of unified empire breaks up into a bunch of feudal kind of kingdoms for about 1,000 years, right? So you get, from about 476 until around the 1400s, you're in what's called the Middle Ages, right? Now this used to be referred to as the Dark Ages, and if you read Postman's book, he still calls this the Dark Ages. I will say no historian worth their salt today calls the Middle Ages the Dark Ages anymore, because actually, well, the Dark Ages was this kind of phrase that comes out of the Enlightenment, where they said, oh, what happens after the collapse of the Roman Empire is the Catholic Church takes over and religion smothers the light of learning from Europe for 1,000 years. That isn't what happened. Right? Yes, the Catholic Church becomes the most powerful institution in medieval society, but a lot of learning actually continues to happen. And well, Europe goes into the Middle Ages, say technologically behind places like India and China. It comes out of the Middle Ages far ahead technologically, and I mean even after it emerges, the kind of Islamic empires, first, well, the kind of Arabian and then Ottoman empires are way ahead of Europe technologically. By the end of the Middle Ages, Europe is well ahead in all sorts of ways in terms of technology. So the Enlightenment says, oh, that was a dark age. It really wasn't. But what does happen is that whole political system that the Romans had built falls apart, and you get kind of feuding kingdoms. But what really is important here is that you get a fundamental reorganization of society away from the imperial Roman system to feudalism. And one of the things that Postman is correct about is that reading becomes far less important because there isn't any longer this massive bureaucracy that needs to maintain this far-flung empire, right? The ability to read becomes much more condensed into a much smaller scribal and priestly class, mostly controlled and educated by the Roman Catholic Church. Now, literacy plunges, but it plunges for a really good reason. Nobody really needed to read during this period, right? The social environment wasn't one that really required anybody or a large number of people to be literate, so most people weren't. Okay. So, according to Postman, and I think he's right here, without reading, culture became primarily oral, right? So it became mostly about verbal communication in some way. And most people really never needed anything more than kind of basic skills to speak and communicate with others, right? Again, there is this kind of class of, priests, monks, and, basically courtesans that serve kings and nobles that are able to read and write, but most people just really have no use for it, right? Their lives are very much agricultural, built in communities, built around particular skills that are taught to them by masters, and so don't really require reading and writing skills. A lot of things in medieval society are just not that complex, right? You live probably in a village, and if you manage to get a few, 10, 20 kilometers away from your home, you've done more than the average medieval person, right? Because most people lived and died, in a very small kind of location. So reading wasn't as essential as it was during the Roman period. Most people, it's a time that's relatively poor. Most people in the Middle Ages tended to live broadly in pretty close quarters, right? Most of them out of the cities, right? The big Roman cities kind of collapsed at the end of the Roman Empire, and most people moved into rural communities. Most people, in feudal society would have been serfs who lived on plots of land that their family had occupied for decades or even centuries that were owned by a feudal lord, and they probably lived in a 1 or 2 room house, right? So they lived in pretty close quarters. So one of the things that happens, there's no sense of private space in the Middle Ages, right? And what this means is, children are not shielded from the adult world at all, right? And Postman has some, anecdotes, of, what communal meals looked like, and the fact that, in the Middle Ages, as a joke, people would have, grabbed the genitals of children. But I mean, just kind of on a basic level, if there's no private or personal space and no sense of the private, right, all sorts of things become pretty apparent, right? If you live in a 1-bedroom house or 1-room house, with your family and your parents have, 6 or 7 children, you end up with a pretty good sense of how those children were ultimately created. Because there's not a whole lot of sense of privacy going on, right? Education, right, in a hierarchical sense, where you kind of start with the basics and learn, disappears in all but a few cases, right? In terms of people who are selected, again, mostly by the scribal or priestly class to kind of be, the learned men of that society, but it's mostly just not that useful. Okay. So, what brings all of this to an end? Fundamentally, what brings the Middle Ages to an end is the printing press, right? The printing press is a phenomenal invention in the history of kind of Western society. It essentially transforms medieval society into something altogether different. Now, a lot of these changes had, like I said, sort of been bubbling for a while, right? There'd been a lot of technological progress in the West, but the invention of the printing press essentially makes information much more available to a lot more people, right? Because it suddenly, well, I'll put it this way. I'll tell the story of Johannes Gutenberg because it's a fun story. Because we hail Gutenberg for his invention, but sadly, the man never really got to profit from his own invention, an invention that transformed, society fundamentally. So Gutenberg, in what we would think of as Germany today, basically was a kind of, tinkerer and innovator. He was a goldsmith by trade, and he comes up with this idea, right? That basically, one of the things that Gutenberg knows is that people really love the Bible, right? And Bibles are super hard to get, right? Why? Because every text in the Middle Ages, if you're going to get a copy of it, has to be copied by hand. And if you've ever looked at the Bible, you can imagine how long it would take you to copy that by hand. And it's not just that they were like physically writing the letters. In the Middle Ages, they'd also come up with this thing where they had illuminated manuscripts. So you had to make everything pretty, right? So you're not just copying the letters, as you might in a notebook, you're making like images, and some of the letters are cursive and all swirly and all of this stuff. If you ever just Google illuminated manuscripts, they're really cool looking, but you can imagine how long it would take to physically copy one of these, right? So there's Irish monks somewhere in some monastery, copying everything by hand for centuries, which makes things really, really, really expensive, right? Because if you're going to buy something that took someone maybe 3 years of their life to produce or more, right? Depending on how good they are at copying. So Gutenberg comes up with this cool idea. He's like, what if I could make a whole bunch of Bibles? And he knows that there's a religious fair going on in a neighboring town in Germany, the next year. He's like, how could I make a bunch of Bibles? And he's a goldsmith, and he comes up with this idea basically of creating movable type, right? Basically making the letters shapes, dipping them in ink, and using an old wine press that he's purchased on credit. He borrowed money to do all of this in order to produce, the pages of the Bible over and over again, so he can make a bunch of copies and then sell them and make a ton, right? Because this way he thinks he can make copies of the Bible much more quickly. And he succeeds, right? He actually does copy the entire Bible, makes multiple copies of it, and heads off to this town for what he thinks is this religious fair, only to discover that he got the year wrong, and it actually had happened the year prior. So he goes back home, and his creditors, who had lent him the money to make this printing press, and they're like, you promised us we were going to get our money back. And he's like, so the thing is, no, they seize the Bibles, and they seize the printing press, right, as creditors are wont to do. Don't pay your car payment, they're going to take your car. If you invent a printing press and you don't pay your creditors, they get the printing press. And so Gutenberg dies in obscurity, but his creditors very quickly realize the genius of what he's created, right? And they themselves go on to profit massively from both the original copies of the Bible that he's created and the invention itself. So suddenly we have a technology to print things. Now, even then, if you want to print things, you need something to print. And there's only going to be so much demand for the Bible at the end of the day. But it just so happens that around the same time, there's been a sort of renewed interest in the classics, right? Europe is, for a lot of reasons, has been really interested, really from sort of the 14th century, the 1300s, in people like Aristotle and Plato, right? And if you look at, say, a 14th century kind of scholar like St. Thomas Aquinas or Maimonides, right? They were really interested in classical works of Aristotle. And so they had become very prominent, and there's a big demand for the original texts of all of these Greek thinkers. And they suddenly start to become available from a few sources. For one, you do have Arabic copies of these works that start to trickle into the West from the Ottoman Empire, right? The kind of Ottoman and kind of Muslim rulers of the Middle East had kept a lot of these texts alive and were very much engaged with them. The other thing that happens is that, in the 1450s, the Ottomans, so the Turks, sack the city of Constantinople, right? Which is, like I said, is modern day Istanbul, is the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, or what you would call the Byzantine Empire, probably if you're looking at history. And, with the Muslim conquest of kind of this big Greek-speaking city, a lot of the monks and scholars grab their copies of Aristotle and Plato and all the others that they've been holding on to for centuries and basically hoof it for Christian lands, right? So they're heading across into Germany and Italy where they think they'll be safe from the Ottoman Turks. So they bring a bunch of these things as well. There's also the discovery that the Irish have been copying these things painstakingly by hand in Catholic monasteries in Ireland. So you have interest, and now you have a product, and people start to copy the books. The other thing that kind of works in their favor is two things that ended up getting transferred along the Silk Road from China, right? Paper and ink that you could use for this kind of publishing. Basically, paper-making technology, right? How you would make paper first out of parchment, right? So essentially cloth that you break down and turn into a kind of paper, and then pulp paper kind of comes to the West via the Silk Road from China. People figure out how they did it, and now you have three things. You have a device that can print, you have things that people want to read, and you have the ability to make something cheap that they can read it on. Because prior to that, people were reading on, not papyrus. Papyrus was the Romans. It's basically made out of animal hides, and it was super expensive. And I can't remember the word for it right at this moment, but it will come to me. And so, these older copies of the Bible are written on like goat skin or something like that. Very, very tough and very difficult to produce at scale. Paper is very easy to produce at scale. So the technology gets adopted very, very quickly. And I mean, basically, within about 80 years, you have printing presses in all of the major European countries, right? I know that seems slow because you're like, well, the iPhone was released in 2007, and by say like 2015 everybody had one, but by the standards of the time that's really, really quick. Okay, how much time do I have left? 8 minutes. Okay, I can do this. Well, I mean, I can't get through this whole section, but we got lots of time. For Postman, what happens with printing is it changes the fundamental kind of economic balance of the whole society, right? If you've ever heard this kind of aphorism from Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message, right? Postman is a real believer in that this idea that the communication technology of a particular time ultimately reshapes the way people think about things and can actually reshape societies as a whole. As much as I first read this, Understanding Media, the Extension of Man from Marshall McLuhan when I was an undergrad, and no matter how hard I try to get away from this idea, I always end up coming back to it because, like, just in this recent book that I've been reading, Generations by Jean Twenge, she's got her technology model of generations, and I'm like, fuck, this is the medium is the message again. Like, do I ever get to leave you, Marshall? No, I don't. Okay. And more than that, Harold Innis, who was his kind of teacher as well, had a similar idea in a book called Empire and Communication. But anyway, right, what Postman thinks is that printing starts to create a separation between children and adults, right? Whereas in the Middle Ages, right, by age 7, right, you had the speaking skills you needed to become an apprentice, right, to go to work, to understand the basics of medieval society, and to participate in economic life. Print allows people to communicate information much more efficiently. It allows for a ton of information, right? It allows for knowledge to move between places much more quickly. And what Postman says is adult knowledge, even in the kind of basics of life, starts to outpace just the common knowledge you would have just by living in major ways. And he thinks reading becomes the basis for adulthood in lots of ways. Right, because as the economy gets more complex, as more complex industries appear, and then once you get to the period of industrialization, right, reading becomes 100% necessary to enter adult life. Okay, right, so children can speak and understand speech, right? That's not a problem. So in the Middle Ages, they were able to participate in the economy very quickly. But children need to be taught to read, right? And it's a pretty painstaking process. It takes a long time, and it doesn't come quickly, right? Even if they understand the basics of reading, the need to kind of increase the complexity of their reading, their vocabulary, and the thinking that goes along with it takes a really long time, right? And so what Postman thinks is print and this need to cultivate people for a long time into the medium that makes them an adult means they have to be given this period of innocence and removal from social obligation in lots of ways in order to develop those skills. So for Postman, print makes childhood not just, possible, it does, but also necessary, right? You can't have childhood without kind of print, because print is what ultimately, the written word and needing to learn the written word to be part of adult society is what makes that period of cultivation necessary at the end of the day. You don't need a lot of cultivation if all you're going to be doing is, milking cows and plowing fields. But when it gets to more complex things in societies like banking, like lending, like being a scribe, like working in heavy industries, it becomes more necessary to have that period of cultivation. Okay. Oh, Nunny McShame. I like you. Okay, Postman's 3 conditions for childhood then ultimately are these 3 things. Shame. My dad's 77 now. So he grew up in a very different world, something that I'm always reminded of talking to him. He went to Catholic boarding schools. Essentially, the Catholic boarding schools, because his parents were lumberjacks. They ran a lumber mill. And I remember him always telling that there was one nun at this Catholic boarding school that they called Sister Paul the Murderer. And I always think of Sister Paul the Murderer when I see this lady. I don't know why. Okay, so shame, right? So what is shame? Basically, some idea that certain things are not for children, Postman thinks, is the basis for an idea of childhood. Literacy, right, which is essentially the mode in which shame is maintained. I'll get to you in 1 second. And then schools, which is where literacy is taught. Yeah, please.
So like shame in the sense like shame that like you should know that you are a child.
There are certain things that you shouldn't tell a child because they're right, because children shouldn't know about sex, right? That it should be something because they're innocent, right? That innocence should be maintained. They shouldn't find out about sexual things until they're properly sort of prepared for it and mature enough and have the cognitive level to understand it. Politics, right? They shouldn't have to worry about the wars happening in the world because they're just children, right? And they should have that innocence maintained. Economics, right? Like it's funny, how much time do I have? enough time for this anecdote. One of the weird disagreements I have with my wife is she has this very kind of old school thing of like, our kids shouldn't know how much money we have or make. She's like, well, they don't need to worry about money. And I'm like, okay, that's weird. We should teach them kind of economics, like how to manage money. And it helps to know, how much money comes off of your paycheck. Oh my God, it's so much, when you get paid. So it's like, oh yes, I make this amount of money, but this is how much the government takes in taxes, because she was taught in this very kind of traditional way that money is shameful, right? That you shouldn't discuss money with children. And it's a sort of hangover of this idea that there are some things that aren't appropriate for children to know. Okay, well, as people are walking out on me and I got 1 minute left, that's a good place to stop. We'll pick up with this slide on Friday, and we'll keep going. Okay.
I don't know where it is.
Well, follow me.
Yeah.
I know where it is.
Yeah, I literally was like, I walked into my resource sociology class today, and it's PhD, like they're up to graduate, so they haven't. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm talking about. So, anyways, it's
Yeah, they're like a candidate.
Yeah, that's a word. Yeah. And they were like, I was reading in their syllabus, and they just seemed like not very nice. They were like, if you have COVID, that's not a valid excuse. I will not be catching you up. Like, you need to make friends in the class. Yeah, and I was like, you know what? I'm about to graduate. I was like, I know he's not a nice professor, so I'm just going to figure out this.
I don't know. Honestly, I do not know why people do stuff like that. It just.
Oh, and it said that there's like.